Tekst. Nie mam tekstu. Może być fascynująca. Jak wiele tajemnic czeka jeszcze na odkrycie? Jak wiele z nich czeka właśnie na Ciebie? Dobry wieczór Państwu. Krzysztof Bogalecki. Witam serdecznie na kolejnym spotkaniu pełnym naukowych inspiracji i porządnej dawki wiedzy. A to wszystko dzięki Fundacji En Arche, rozpowszechniającej wiedzę o teorii inteligentnego projektu, współpracującej z ośrodkami akademickimi, prowadzącej projekty z grupami specjalistów i konsultantów i publikującej tłumaczenia z w wysoko punktowanych czasopismach naukowych. To właśnie dzięki jej staraniom będziemy dzisiaj gościć wybitnego niemieckiego paleontologa i entomologa, doktora Güntera Bechly, absolwenta biologii na Uniwersytecie w Hohenheim oraz zoologii, parazytologii i paleontologii na Uniwersytecie w Tübingen. Krótko o naszym gościu. Organizator wystawy Rzeka Życia 150 lat teorii ewolucji na zamku Rosenstein w Stuttgarcie, którą odwiedziło ponad 90 000 gości i która okazała się być jednym z największych wydarzeń roku 2009 w Niemczech. Obecnie starszy naukowiec w Biological Institute w Redmond w Stanach Zjednoczonych i starszy pracownik w Center for Science and Culture przy Discovery Institute w Seattle. Współzałożyciel i prezes naukowego stowarzyszenia Centrum für Biokomplexität und Naturtheologie, który jako nasz dzisiejszy ekspert opowie o niedociągłościach zapisu kopalnego jako problemie dla darwinizmu. Wystąpienie prelegenta będzie transmitowane w 2 wersjach językowych. Poniżej w opisie znajdą Państwo link do wersji bez tłumaczenia na język polski, a po prawej stronie ekranu okno czatu, gdzie wyświetlimy wszystkie pomocne linki i gdzie mogą Państwo przez cały czas trwania spotkania zadawać naszemu gościowi pytania. Zapraszamy Państwa do czynnego udziału. Transmisję można też obejrzeć na naszym fanpage'u na Facebooku, którego link już wkleiliśmy na czacie. Prosimy też zostać z nami do końca, ponieważ po wykładzie nasz gość odpowie na zadane przez Państwa pytania, a dla wszystkich, którzy z nami zostaną, będziemy mieli prezent. Kod rabatowy na wszystkie książki z księgarni En Arche. Już teraz zapoznajcie się Państwo z dostępnymi pozycjami, które dziś będzie można kupić z 30% rabatem. Link do księgarni znajdziecie Państwo na czacie. Nie przedłużając, zapraszamy do wysłuchania wykładu i zadawania pytań. Przed Państwem dr Günter Bechly z prelekcją o tytule Nieciągłości zapisu kopalnego jako problem dla darwinizmu.
Make certain predictions, and then we can compare the predictions of the theory with the actual facts of nature and can see if the theory matches with the facts. So one of the predictions and one of the core predictions, the most important predictions of Darwinism is gradualism. It is not for nothing that Charles Darwin wrote in his book, The Origin of Species, 6 times the Latin sentence natura non facit saltus, which means nature doesn't make jumps. So Darwin said this because he wanted to have a naturalistic, not a miraculous explanation for the history of life. And so he knew if there would be saltations and jumps in the history of life, this would point to a non-naturalistic explanation. So he said all changes have to come about by the addition of many small changes over time. So this is a core prediction. It's not just a prediction from Darwin himself that is maybe obsolete and outdated by modern evolutionary theory. It's still valid. And one indication is something that one of the most famous popularizers of Darwin's theory, which is the British biologist Richard Dawkins. He wrote in a book in 2009, The Greatest Show on Earth, the following interesting sentence. Evolution not only is a gradual process, as a matter of fact, it has to be gradual if it is to do any explanatory work. Which means if it should turn out that the history of life is not gradual, then it's not just a minor problem for the theory, but then the theory is basically refuted and cannot explain what it sets out to explain. So let's have a look. So, of course, already Darwin was aware that there were gaps in the fossil record, there were discontinuities, but Darwin appealed to the incompleteness of the fossil record and hoped that over time, further research will solve the problem. And still today, many people will say, well, these are gaps of evidence, gaps of knowledge. And a famous paleontologist once said, gaps of evidence are gaps of evidence and not evidence of gaps. So he also meant it's just a lack of knowledge, but it's not really that these discontinuities are out there in nature. Is this really true? Actually, we can find out quite easily. And a nice analogy to explain how we can find out was given by my colleague Paul Nelson. And he said the following. Imagine you have a new hobby, and the hobby is beachcombing. So you walk along the shore and you look what the flood washes in, and you collect shells and mussels and starfish. And every day you find something new in the beginning. But the longer you do this hobby, the more repetition sets in, and you start to find the same things that you have already discovered again and again. And ultimately, you reach a point where you only find the same stuff over and over again, nothing new or only very rarely. And then you know that you have reached a certain point of saturation, where what's still missing is not because you were too lazy to collect more, it's because the stuff is not out there. And the same approach is actually used in paleontology to test if the fossil record is incomplete or if gaps in the fossil record and discontinuities are really a signal from nature. And this method in paleontology is called the collector's curve. So the collector's curve you can imagine like a mathematical chart where you have a horizontal axis and a vertical axis. In the horizontal axis, you plot the effort that you have to invest to find new fossils, new fossil groups, new fossil species. This effort you can measure however you want, in man hours or in grant money, or an energy that you have to invest in excavations. And in the vertical axis, you plot the number of newly discovered fossil stuff. And in the beginning, this curve that you can plot is very steep, which means you don't have to invest a lot of time, money, and energy to find something new. But then the curve flattens, and that means then you have reached this point of repetition, of saturation, where you need a lot of money, a lot of energy, a lot of man hours to still find something new. And this kind of statistical test has been applied in paleontology in many, many groups. And overall, we can say that the fossil record is complete enough that we can say the still present gaps and discontinuities on the higher level, on the macroevolutionary level, they are not artifacts of undersampling. They are not artifacts because we didn't look enough, because the fossil record is incomplete. They are really gaps in the history of life that tell us something. Of course, the fossil record will always be incomplete on the species level, but that is relatively irrelevant for macroevolution. We want to know the big transitions. How did tetrapods originate? How did the feather come into being, or the vertebrate eye, and all this kind of stuff? And there we all know now that the intermediate forms that we have found are a very good and complete picture about the history of life. So one final point we have to know before we look into some of the details of the fossil record is when I will tell you that some groups came into being in very short windows of time, and I will say within 5 or 10 million years, then you may think, well, that sounds like a lot of time, because in human terms, in human history, this would be an unbelievable long time. But actually, in terms of biology or also in geology, this is a very, very abrupt window of time. And the reason is the following. There are very good estimates about the duration that the lifespan, the longevity a species has. This means the time a species exists from its origin till its end. And in the textbooks, you can find these numbers. They vary in different groups between 2.5 and 10 million years. So 5 to 10 million years window of time means just 1 or 2 successive species, which of course would be an impossible task for evolution to achieve a major re-engineering of a body plan within just the lifespan of 2 successive species. So that tells you something what is to be considered abrupt in geological and biological terms. So if we look in Earth history, there is a time very early in the history of Earth where life could not exist, or if it came into being, it would have been extinguished again. And this time is called the late heavy bombardment. It is about 3.8 to 4.1 billion years ago. And there were really a lot of very big impacts. So if you think of the impact, the meteorite that is said to have killed off the dinosaurs at the end of the Cretaceous age, about 65 million years ago, this was a meteorite of the size of about 10 to 15 kilometers diameter. In this era of Earth history, there were impactors, meteorites of 500 to 1,000 kilometers of diameter. And there have been studies that showed that these impacts of meteorites in this period of Earth history have several times totally evaporated the oceans of the Earth. So with each of these impacts, the Earth would have been sterilized, and life couldn't either not have existed before, or if it would have existed, it would have been removed again, and the clock would have set again to zero. So this took till 3.8 billion years ago. And surprisingly, already 3.8 billion years ago are our oldest evidences, fossil evidences for the first life. There are some very controversial fossils that are said to be older, but they are likely artifacts. They are not recognized by mainstream paleontology as unequivocal evidence for living beings. You have to think we are not talking about dinosaur fossils here, but about fossils of bacteria-like single-celled organisms. So 3.8 billion years is the oldest uncontroversial evidence for life. That is immediately at the first point in Earth history where life could exist. So from Darwinian expectations, we should expect, let's say, 1 billion years of chemical evolution after the end of the late heavy bombardment to get the first cell. But actually, boom, at the very first moment where life was possible, we get the first living cells in the form of bacteria. This is surprising and counter the expectations of the theory, and it continues. It's not just that any kind of life is present 3.8 billion years ago, but blue-green bacteria, which are capable of photosynthesis. Now, photosynthesis, this physiological process to transform the light of the sun into biological matter and to produce energy, biological energy and matter from light, this process is so complex and involves so complex proteins that, again, you should expect to find this after a long time of gradual, slow evolution, adding many steps to each other. But actually, it's boom there at the very first moment where life is present on our planet. And if we go a little bit further in Earth history, we come to a point where there are the first macrofossils, which means fossils that even a layman would recognize as the fossil remains of organisms of any kind. And this is the so-called Ediacaran biota, and the event that is correlated with the origin of these fossils is the so-called Avalon explosion. Explosion already tells you something. These fossils appear suddenly without precursors in the preceding geological layers. They appear about 570 million years ago. They are very strange, very alien looking. They are certainly not the precursors of later groups of organisms. They have a different symmetry. They have a kind of air mattress-like construction. They have no visible organs, and nobody knows what they are, if they were animals, fungi, plants, or giant protists. It's unknown, but what is known is that they appear suddenly without precursors, no gradual building up of these diverse, strange organisms, and then they go extinct at the end of the so-called Ediacaran age, about 542 million years ago. And then the next event in Earth history, and we will now continue to make a kind of travel in time, going further and further closer to recent times. And we will encounter now, about 520 million years ago, the Cambrian Explosion. Again, explosion tells you something. It's not a gradual event, as Darwin would predict. And this event is the origin of complex animal body plans, the so-called animal phyla. And there we find 20 of the 33 known animal phyla are abruptly appearing in the Cambrian explosion. This event has been called in a cover of Time magazine, Evolution's Big Bang. And animal phyla are groups, for example, like vertebrates and arthropods, and then you have millions of species of arthropods, or mollusks, and then you have a lot of different mollusks, mussels and cephalopods and so on. So these major body plans, these major categories, these big differences in construction, they appear suddenly in the Cambrian. And of course, this was a problem for Darwinists, and so they tried to explain this away. And they came up with an ad hoc explanation, and this was the so-called artifact hypothesis. They said, well, probably there had to be ancestors of these Cambrian animal phyla, but we didn't find them because there were only suitable geological conditions in the Cambrian, but no such layers existed in the Ediacaran, in the preceding geological strata. And therefore, we didn't find the fossil organisms, even though they existed. It's a kind of artifact of the fossil record. Now, this was a valid explanation until a few years ago, but then we started to discover Ediacaran localities which have the same geological properties like these famous Cambrian localities where we find these Cambrian soft-bodied small organisms like the Burgess Shale in Canada or the Shenyang locality in China. And we found layers that are exactly comparable in the preserving conditions. They could have preserved small, soft-bodied precursors of the Cambrian animal phyla, but there's nothing there than algae. And even mainstream evolutionary biologists now admit that the animals are not absent in these strata because we didn't find them, but because they didn't exist yet. And these are layers about 550 to 540 million years ago. So two other explanations how scientists try to get rid of this strange Cambrian explosion is that they said, well, there are these strange small shelly fauna, this small shelly fauna, and there's a continuity in these fossils from the Ediacaran. Ediacaran is the terminal age prior to the Cambrian, and the small shelly fauna of the Cambrian. But actually, if you look at the fossils, you will find that the Cambrian small shelly fauna, these are fragments of hard parts of known animal groups. So, for example, from shells of mollusks or from echinoderms or from arthropods, fragments of their skeleton. And what we find in the Ediacaran, the so-called Ediacaran small shelly fauna, is basically just three different groups, three different genera, and the two most frequent are Cludina and Namacalatus, and the third is Namapoica. All three are certainly totally unrelated to the Cambrian animal phyla. They have a totally different construction. They cannot be the ancestors of the Cambrian animal phyla. How do we know? Because we have a lot of those fossils and they show a kind of branching growth pattern. And that is totally unlike the growth of typical bilaterian animals that we find in the Cambrian. So there is no continuity in these two small shelly faunas. They are totally different, and there is no gradual transformation of one into the other. Another argument that has been used to make a connection between the Ediacaran age and the Cambrian were trace fossils. So sometimes fossils are not preserving the body of an organism, but just its living traces. So the footprints they left in the ground when they walked or crawled, or burrows that they were digging in the seafloor, or remnants of their excrements and something like that. So there were trace fossils from the Ediacaran, and scientists said, well, we don't have the fossils of the bodies of the precursors of the Cambrian fauna, but we have their traces. But actually, this was proven by a very important paper by Mariotti et al. In 2016. So if you look at this color plate on my slide, what you see in the left column are the original traces that we find in the Ediacaran. And you see they look like a worm crawling on the seafloor, or like an arthropod walking. But what the experiment did by Mariotti is they said, hey, what is typical for the Ediacaran is that the bacterial mats were covering the seafloor. So let's grow bacterial microbial mats in a aquarium tank and look what happens when we stir them up and let them settle again. And what they found is that you could reproduce all these kind of alleged animal traces from the Ediacaran by just stirring up bacterial mats, and then you get some kind of artifacts, folding, shrinking structures. And what you see on the right side of the color plate is the structures that they could produce in the experiment in this aquarium tank without any participation of animals causing those traces. And you see one-to-one correspondence that you could reproduce all these kinds of tracks. So these tracks have been refuted. We can no longer say that there are animal traces from the Ediacaran that could be some kind of precursor of the Cambrian animal phyla. And finally, there's also a point where I want to show you that you have to watch out what people tell you about modern research. So there was recently in 2018 a paper, a study on the origin of arthropods, and it was cherished in the popular press as a study that proved the Cambrian explosion was not so abrupt. It was a gradual event that took 40 million years. But actually, if you really look at the scientific paper and look what they found the exact opposite. They made the Cambrian explosion more abrupt and more problematic. So what did they find? They looked for the oldest fossil possible ancestors of arthropods, so primitive precursors of arthropods. And what they found were animals that were about 518 million years old. Then they looked, how old are the oldest, more modern arthropods? And they found these more modern arthropods were 521 million years old. Oops, that's a problem. If the more modern animals are older than the more primitive animals, their alleged ancestors, so they had to postulate a so-called ghost lineage. Of course, the ancestors must be older than the descendants, so they had to reverse the actual order that they found in the fossil record. And they said, well, maybe we can solve the problem by looking at trace fossils. And they found trace fossils 537 million years ago. But these trace fossils were trace fossils of the so-called Rusophycus type. And Rusophycus is a very famous trace fossils that every paleontology student will encounter, and it's the resting trace of a trilobite. So it's evidence for modern arthropods 537 million years ago. So that's 19 million years older than the more ancestral, allegedly more ancestral arthropods. So an even bigger problem. And then the authors looked at the Ediacaran fossils, and they found those localities that are like the Cambrian localities, and they discovered, well, 550 million years ago, certainly there were no arthropods, there were no animals. So what they actually found is that you have just 13 million years, from 550 million years to 537 million years, to get from some jelly-like ancestor of animals to a fully formed trilobite-like arthropod with exoskeleton, with articulated legs, with compound eyes. And this is just 30 million years, the lifespan of one or two successive marine invertebrate species. Totally ridiculous to believe that you could make this transformation from a blob of jelly to a trilobite in this biologically short window of time. So the study proved the Cambrian explosion is even a bigger problem, not less of a problem. And if we continue through Earth history, and I will just quickly show you some general pattern, is that this famous Cambrian explosion is not an exception from the rule, but shows the general pattern in all eras of Earth history, in all groups of organisms. So the next would be the great Ordovician biodiversification event. Ordovician is the next age. We are about 470 million years ago now. And there is something that has been called in New Scientist life's second Big Bang. Again, such a discontinuous event, not a gradual building up step by step, slowly transformation, but boom, new forms appear, hundreds of new families of invertebrates in the oceans. We find now the diversification of these Cambrian phyla into different families in an explosive event of diversification. And this is strange because what Darwin would suggest that first you had one species, an ancestor of all animals, and then this diversified into two different species, and they diversified further, and different genera, and then after millions of years, they became different families, and ultimately, after they have become different orders, maybe they reach the point where they are different phyla, different body plans. But what we find instead of this bottom-up process is a top-down process. We find the big differences, the different body plans first in the Cambrian explosion, and then we find the playing on this motif of these different body plans, the diversification of the body plans in the Ordovician diversification event. So we find a top-down pattern rather than a bottom-up pattern, totally the opposite than the theory predicts. And if we go further in Earth history and we go back, let's say, 400 to 420 million years, we find the first land plants. And this has been called the Siluro-Devonian terrestrial revolution. Always when you hear in biosciences the word revolution, you know that it's not a gradual event. Nobody calls a gradual development a revolution. So Silurian, Devonian are the two next ages in Earth history. And the sudden appearance of land plants has been called in a mainstream science paper by Bateman et al. The terrestrial equivalent of the much debated Cambrian explosion. So we find the same abrupt pattern again with the land plants. And in the Devonian, we find another event that has been called revolution by a former study friend of mine, Christian Klug, who has described the Devonian Nekton revolution. And what happened in the Devonian about 400 million years ago is that the composition of marine ecosystem totally changed. You have three different ways how animals could live in the ocean. They can live close to the seafloor. This is called demersal. They can swim passively in the water column. This is called nekton. And they can actively swim like fish do. This is called the nekton. So what we find in the Devonian is, if you look at this colored chart, that before 400 million years ago, there was most of the biodiversity in terms of percentage was dominated by plankton and ground living organisms. And after this sudden event, the majority of biodiversity in the ocean was made by actively swimming animals like cephalopods and fish, the so-called nekton. A sudden event that also correlates with an explosive origin of tooth-like structures in different groups of fish, in lobe-finned fish, ray-finned fish, and the shark-ray relationship. And this has been called the odontode explosion. Not by creationists or Darwin critics. All these terms, revolution, explosion, are terms in mainstream evolutionary biology and paleontology. And also in the Devonian, you find another revolution, the Devonian terrestrial revolution. And there's something from Poland, something interesting that happened. So you maybe have seen this evolutionary lineage from fish-like ancestors to the first tetrapods, which looked like salamanders. And there were forms like Ichthyostega and Acanthostega in the Devonian that were the first tetrapods. And then we found the so-called fisherpods like Tiktaalik that still have fins but are proposed as ancestors of the tetrapods. The problem is then there were discovered tracks of tetrapods, of four-legged land animals in Poland, the so-called Zachelmi tracks. And the Zachelmi tracks turned out to be 10 million years older, not only than Ichthyostega, not only older than Tiktaalik, but older than even the salmon-like Oysthenopteron and other so-called fisherpods. So the tetrapods, the four-legged land animals, predate 10 million years any fish-like alleged ancestors. And this, of course, is a problem. It's a temporal paradox, which shows that not only did this group came into being very abruptly, but in an order that is the opposite of the Darwinian prediction. In my own field of expertise, I'm an insect paleontologist, and there is something that is called the Carboniferous insect explosion in the next age, about 320 to 310 million years ago, in the Carboniferous age, where the coal deposit mostly come from. And what we find in the Carboniferous is that all the different so-called orders of flying insect, orders are these big groups like beetles, and then we have 600,000 species of beetles, and then we have flies, and we have wasps and 100,000s of species of those, and then we have dragonflies and mayflies and locusts. So these are the large categories in the realm of flying insects, and they all appear suddenly between the border of the lower to the upper Carboniferous. And it's not only that we find there the so-called primitive flying insect, like dragonflies or mayflies or cockroaches. What we also find with these earliest flying insects is insects of the so-called holometabola. And these are insects that have these complete development mode of metamorphosis, where the larva does not longer develop gradually with one molting, one stage after the other, gradually becoming more similar to the adult insect, but where you have a very different larval stage, like a caterpillar, then having a resting stage, the pupa, where the whole body is dissolved into a kind of soup, into a liquid, and then rearranged into the totally different body of, say, a butterfly. So this is already a miraculous thing to think about. How could this evolve? But if it could evolve at all, which I doubt, then we should expect that it took hundreds of millions of years for something like this to originate. But no, we find the first groups of these metamorphoses like insects, like beetles and wasps already in the Carboniferous, which is totally strange and surprising. And in the next age, in the Triassic, after the biggest mass extinction in Earth history, which happened about 252 million years ago, we find a real carpet bombing-like pattern of explosions. And there has been a book about it by Peter Ward, and Peter Ward is an evolutionist, a star critic of intelligent design. And the title of his book is Out of Thin Air. And here's a quote from his book. these explosions in the Triassic was as important for animal life on land as the Cambrian explosion was for marine animal life. So the same pattern for terrestrial animals as for the marine animals, again in the Triassic. That's the words of an evolutionist, not my personal interpretation. And just to show you what happened in the Triassic, we find all the first representative of the major groups of land-living vertebrate animals. So the first real mammals, the first real iguana-like lizards, the first of the crocodile group, the first of the turtle group, the first of the dinosaur group. And they all appear in a few million year window of time in the Triassic. Concerning marine reptiles, before this event in the Triassic, there were no marine reptile families, different body plans of marine reptiles, and this jumped suddenly to 15 different groups. And here you see just a selection of these different body plans of marine reptiles that originated in this time. Among them also ichthyosaurs, which made a transition from assumed land-living lizard-like ancestors to these complete dolphin or shark-like marine lizards of the ichthyosaurs. This happened within a 4 to 5 million year window of time. This is the lifespan of a single larger vertebrate species. Impossible to make this transition in Darwinian, with Darwinian methods naturalistically. It's unbelievable. And also flying reptiles in the Triassic, within just 2 million years, we find different solutions for gliding and flying, including the first pterosaurs. And finally, dinosaurs. Everybody is interested in dinosaurs, especially children. And there's something in the Triassic that has been called the Dinosaur Explosion. And there has been a paper recently, just 2 years ago. And here's a quote from this paper about the origin of dinosaurs in the Triassic. And it says, "It's amazing how clear-cut the change from no dinosaurs to all dinosaurs was." That was not in a creation journal or something like that, but in Nature Communications by mainstream evolutionists. The same pattern you find with these marine reptiles. We will make this shorter and move on. Here's a phenomenon that was already known to Darwin, and it's the abrupt origin of flowering plants in the Cretaceous age. And this is about 120 million years ago. And this was so surprising to Darwin that the flowers, these complex structures, reproductive structures of plants, appear so suddenly in the Cretaceous that is so counter his gradualistic expectations that he called it an abominable mystery. And the strange thing is there have been several recent papers that analyzed what happened to this abominable mystery. It has not become less problematic. It has become, with more knowledge, with hundreds and thousands of fossils we have discovered since Darwin, it has become more problematic, more of a problem than in Darwin's time. And this tells you that these gaps and these problems are real, because if they would be artifacts of our knowledge, we would expect that in 150 years of really intense research, which really exponentially increased our knowledge, these gaps should have closed, or at least have gradually become smaller, but actually they have become bigger. And this shows these problems are real. And here is again a quote from a mainstream evolutionist paper: "Flowers sprang forth during the Cretaceous period as fully formed as Aphrodite." The same pattern you find in butterflies. The larger diurnal butterflies appear suddenly in the Tertiary age, about 50 million years ago. With already modern families, we find the same pattern in modern birds. Actually, a famous bird paleontology has called it the Big Bang of bird evolution, that most groups of modern birds appear suddenly in a short window of time in the lower Tertiary, about 60 million years ago. And the same in mammals. And in placental mammals, these are the more modern mammals, like us, not kangaroos or something like that. So the more modern mammals, we distinguish different orders, again, the large categories that would be, for example, primates or carnivores, or ungulates, or whales, or rodents, or elephants. And these groups, what you see here in blue, is a tree that is the most modern tree of the assumed relationships between the mammalian orders. It's based on DNA comparison, the most modern methods used. And the horizontal axis is the time axis, and the position of the nodes of these branches is the position of the assumed splitting event in time based on so-called molecular clock calculations, where the assumption is that mutations tick like a clock and that you can calculate back how long ago did groups separate in the tree of life. And what you find with these red dots are the actual oldest fossil records of these groups. And what you see is that there is a strong mismatch between the assumed branching events in the upper Cretaceous and this narrow yellow band in the lower Tertiary, where all the earliest fossil records of mammalian orders have been discovered. And this mismatch between fossil evidence and molecular clock estimates is not just in mammals, it's basically in every group that has been studied. And this tells you also something. If Darwinism is true, then different evidences should all converge to the same truth. But if molecular evidence and fossil evidence, or morphological evidence and molecular evidence, produce non-congruent results, then there seems to be a problem. And if we look at these oldest fossils of mammals, for example, the oldest bat, it looks already like a modern bat and not like any kind of intermediate forms. And even in our own genus, in the genus Homo, in fossil humans, many people may think, well, we have found all these different fossils of so-called ape men in Eastern Africa. There is a continuity between ape-like ancestors and our own genus and our own species. But this is not actually true. There is a distinct discontinuity between the ape-like forms of the so-called Australopithecines, which is these groups of African ape-like bipedal primates, and on the other hand, our own genus Homo. And this is something that has been found out by one of the most well-reputed paleoanthropologists, John Hawkes. And he published a paper in 2000 where he said that all the differences, the changes between Australopithecines and the genus Homo were sudden and not gradual. And guess how it was called in the press, the result of the study, the Big Bang theory of human evolution. And even if we look at human cultural traits, I have made here a map, a kind of spreadsheet where I have plotted 50 different cultural activities, from primitive stone tool making to the use of fire to carvings and cave paintings and so on. And what you see in green is mere tool use, and what you see in brown is activities that are correlated with something where we can suppose symbolic thinking. So, for example, producing jewelry, ivory carvings, cave paintings. And what we find is a accumulation of origins of evidence for symbolic thinking in the so-called Upper Paleolithic, about 40 to 50,000 years ago. It has been called the Upper Paleolithic Human Revolution. And even though there have been discoveries in southern Africa, in caves like Blombos Cave about 70,000 years ago, those remains from Homo sapiens of this time, they were on the same cultural level as Neanderthals. And it's still true, we find this evidence for symbolic thinking only in this Upper Paleolithic window of time. And evolutionists even speculated that maybe something happened, a rewiring of the brain that is responsible for this. But actually, there is also an anatomical change. If we look at the shape of our skull, this globular brain case happens within Homo sapiens, within our own species. The older ones have an elongate brain case like Neanderthals, but only about 30 to 40,000 years ago, we find fossils with this globular brain case. So of course, if you come from, let's say, a Christian background, the assumption could be, well, if there is such abrupt evidence for symbolic thinking, could this have something to do with what Christian would call the infusion of the image of God? Now, let's change gears and look at something else. What we have looked at before is the great transition, so macroevolution. New body plans, how did new structures arise, new major groups arise. But what about the small transitions, the species to species transitions? That is something that Darwin definitely should have solved. So what does the fossil record say about gradual transformations of one species to the other? Actually, there is hardly any evidence for this. And this is strange. And there were basically just 3 textbook examples that allegedly showed these gradual species to species transitions. Let's have a look at these 3 textbook examples, the only ones that we have in the fossil record. One comes from marine protists of the so-called group, the foraminiferans, which have beautiful skeletons, small structures. And there was a proposed transition from Globorotalia plesiotumida to Globorotalia tumida, so 2 species in the same genus. But then there came a study which restudied new evidence in 2009, published in the prestigious journal PNAS. And the title tells you everything. Evidence for abrupt speciation in a classic case of gradual evolution. So this classical example for gradualism turned out to be indeed abrupt speciation because they found evidence for cryptic species in the material. What about the other examples? One of the 2 other examples were fossil snails from the Tertiary, from the Miocene Steinheim Basin in Germany. And there was a famous paleontologist from the 19th century, Franz Hilgendorf, who studied these fossil snails. And actually, he constructed the first phylogenetic tree with fossils, where he even glued the actual fossil snails on this reconstructed tree. What you see here on the slide is this original tree by Hilgendorf, and he proposed this gradual transformation of the shell types of these different snails of the genus Gyraulus. This genus still exists today. Now, there were early critics who disputed that these were really different species. But of course, it was handy and was a nice example. So it was believed to be real until recently. And then in 2015, there came a study of modern snails of the genus Gyraulus. And they studied these snails in lakes of the Tibetan Plateau on the roof of the world. And what they found is that in the same lake, in the same species, in the same population, you could find all these different shell types as so-called ecophenotypes, which means these shell types are not different species developing into each other. They are just related to different environmental conditions in the same lake. And then you get these different shapes, like the same species of flowers can have a different growth if it grows a little bit more up the mountain or in the valley. So this example has also been refuted. These shell types are no example for species to species transitions. And the last example came from fossil humans, from these ape men from East Africa, and it was from the transition from Australopithecus anamensis to Australopithecus afarensis. The latter, afarensis, is the species of the famous Lucy fossil. And this has been called the strongest case for anagenesis. Anagenesis is the gradual transformation of one species into the other without branching. So just morphing one species into the other by adding of little changes. The strongest case in the fossil record. Then in 2019, we found a skull, the first complete skull of Australopithecus anamensis. And it refuted this case of gradual species to species transition. Why? Because we could date the skull very well with radiometric dating, and it turned out that the 2 species, anamensis and afarensis, actually overlapped in existence for 100,000 of years. So it could not be the case that anamensis dissolved in a way and morphed into afarensis. So all three examples have been knocked down by modern research. And even if we look at the general pattern of the fossil research since Darwin, there has been, for the Darwin year in 2009 and 2010, the celebration, there has been a study by Hunt, published in the American Naturalist, who reevaluated all the fossil evidence for species to species transitions in the fossil record that has been accumulated in 150 years of research after Darwin. And what did he find? Here is his conclusion. And you really have to carefully watch the words to filter out the Darwinian propaganda and get the real message. So I've marked in red what is really important. The meandering and fluctuating trajectories captured in the fossil record are not inconsistent with the centrality of natural selection. That is making a nod to Darwinian evolution and as an evolutionary mechanism, but they probably would not have been predicted without the benefit of an empirical fossil record. This actually says meandering and fluctuating. We didn't find any evidence in 150 years of research for a directional evolution from A to B, but it goes back and forth, a chaotic pattern which doesn't suggest any kind of direction of transformation. And this would not have been predicted without the fossil record, which means actually the theory would have predicted something else. Otherwise, you wouldn't have to say we wouldn't have predicted it without the fossil record. It means the fossil record contradicts the predictions from the theory. And usually, if so much evidence points against the theory, it is time to think and reconsider the theory and not try to explain away the conflicting evidence. That's not what you do in good science. And a final point, if we look at all this fossil evidence for discontinuities, there arises a much larger problem for Darwinism. And as I said, the fossil record is often considered as the best evidence for Darwinism because it establishes deep time and these apparently intermediate forms. So it seems to establish macroevolution. And on the other hand, we have another field that is called population genetics. And this seems to experimentally demonstrate microevolution. So for example, when you have the origin of drug resistance in germs and bacteria in a petri dish, then we can observe this, that their mutation can arise and it can spread and you get these new traits in this bacteria population. So the assumption was, well, if we take this result from microevolution, from population genetic, and we extrapolate this with millions of years, then we have, with a lot of microevolution, the explanation for macroevolution. But actually, when we really combine these two fields and we just use the data and the methods from mainstream evolutionary science, we can show that the neo-Darwinian process fails to be mathematically feasible. If we take the paleontologically, geologically established windows of time for major transitions, for example, let's take the transition from four-legged ancestors, pig-like ancestors, to fully marine whales. And we look what would be necessary genetically to account for this re-engineering of the body plan to get this marine animal, then you can use the methodological apparatus, the formula apparatus of population genetics and put in the numbers, which we have. We know the mutation rates in larger vertebrates. We know the possible population sizes. We know the approximate generation times that would be available for these organisms. And then we can run the numbers. And what we consistently find is that the time that would have been required in a population, in an ancestral population, to get the right mutations, and that these mutations also spread in the population so that it gets a transformation of the whole species. These two so-called waiting times are orders of magnitude. This means at least 10 times, if not hundreds or 1,000 times, longer than the available windows of time in the fossil record. And this means game over for this postulated process of random mutation and natural selection. It cannot account for these transitions. And this is not something that just some Darwin critics from the intelligent design movement or even creationists make up, and it's not true. And people like Richard Dawkins will tell you evolution is a fact, and everybody who doubts is either crazy or dumb, and there is no debate in science. This is simply not true. I participated at a conference in 2016 in London, which was held at the prestigious Royal Society of London, which was co-founded by Newton. And it was a conference called New Trends in Evolutionary Biology. So it was not a creation science conference. And the keynote was held by one of the most famous theoretical evolutionary biologists, Professor Gerd Müller. And look what he showed in his keynote speech. He had this slide. It's titled Explanatory Deficits of the MS Theory. Explanatory deficits means what the theory cannot explain. And MS theory stands for modern synthesis, which is just a synonym for neo-Darwinism, random mutation and natural selection, Darwin's theory. And what he showed, there is a consensus now that the theory cannot explain phenotypic complexity, complex structures, complex organs, phenotypic novelty, new body plans, and non-gradual forms of transition, what we have taught in this lecture, these discontinuities in the fossil record, the abrupt appearances. So complex organs, new organs, and non-gradual transitions. If Darwin's theory cannot explain that, then it cannot explain macroevolution. And nobody, not even the most hardcore young Earth creationists, would doubt that microevolution happens and can be observed, and that maybe one founder species of Darwin finches, of Galapagos finches, evolved naturalistically into 10 or 12 different species of finches. But this does not mean that you can extrapolate this process to explain how you got birds in the first place and feathers. And this is now acknowledged by mainstream theoretical biologists. And when people will tell you, but there is a consensus, 99% of biologists believe in Darwin's theory, then this is totally irrelevant, because 99% of biologists never thought about these issues and have been taught Darwin's theory in school and at university. They apply it in their everyday research in their narrow field, and they never think about the theoretical issues. Those theoretical biologists that really work on this theory, there is a growing consensus that Darwin's theory has failed, and now they desperately look for something else. And there is this whole approach of the so-called extended synthesis, and they look for different processes like niche construction and phenotypic plasticity and natural genetic engineering. None of these processes has yet shown that it can explain these explanatory deficits, or they even require Darwinism to explain their own origin, and therefore cannot solve the problem of the mathematically infeasibility of the Darwinian process. And with this, I want to close my talk. I hope it was not too complicated and you found it interesting, and then we can switch to question and answers. Thank you.
Bardzo dziękujemy panu doktorowi za wystąpienie. Temat naprawdę fascynujący, co zresztą widać po państwa pytaniach i komentarzach. Jeżeli chcecie państwo dowiedzieć się więcej o teorii inteligentnego projektu, zapraszamy na stronę księgarni Fundacji do naszych cykli wydawniczych, seria Inteligentny Projekt oraz Perspektywy Nauki. Każdy z państwa może uzyskać zniżkę 30% na wszystkie książki papierowe w naszej księgarni. Wystarczy przy ich zakupie wpisać kod webinar. Uwaga, kod jest ważny tylko przez najbliższe 24 godziny i nie łączy się z innymi promocjami. Zapraszamy do zakupu teraz, aby nie przegapić tej wyjątkowej okazji. Jest to też świetny moment, aby zakupić jedną z książek i otrzymać comiesięczne stypendium, bowiem trwa konkurs stypendialny na napisanie najlepszego eseju na temat jednej z książek. Link do konkursu znajdziecie państwo na czacie. Ale to nie koniec niespodzianek. Zostańcie państwo do końca, bo po sesji Q&A powiemy, co zrobić, aby w prezencie otrzymać najnowszą książkę pod tytułem Kryzys teorii ewolucji z serii inteligentny projekt. Zatem, drodzy Państwo, przechodzimy do pytania pierwszego. Co miał na myśli Dawkins, kiedy napisał, że dopiero Darwin sprawił, że ateizm stał się satysfakcjonujący intelektualnie?
Yes, when Darwin made the statement that only Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist, what he referred to is that before Darwin, it was clear for everybody who looked at the complexity of nature and, for example, at the human eye, that this pointed to design and therefore pointed to theism. But Dawkins thought that Darwin made an alternative, a naturalistic explanation that could dispense with the God hypothesis and therefore made it possible to be rational in rejecting God and to believe in atheism without making totally crazy assumptions about the origin of biological complexity. But if Darwinism is false and can be shown scientifically to be false, then of course this leads to the return of the God hypothesis, and this is actually the newest book by Stephen C. Meyer, one of the founders of the intelligent design movement, which just came out and which everybody encourage to read, The Return of the God Hypothesis.
Wspólnoty pochodzenia. Czy akceptujesz ideę wspólnoty pochodzenia?
What I personally think about this, I would like to explain that in the intelligent design movement, you find all kind of different approaches to the question of common descent. So you will find people that believe in so-called progressive creation, so that there were different events in Earth history where there was a creation of new groups. And there are others who accept more or less limited common ancestry or even embrace universal common ancestry, like people like Michael Behe or Michael Denton or myself. So personally, I think the empirical evidence is still best explained by some theory of universal common descent or universal common ancestry. And I think the crucial question is not what is the material continuity in terms of ancestry or descent in Earth history, but how do you explain the changes, the transformations? Can this be explained naturalistically with an unguided process of Darwinism, or does it require the infusion of new information from outside of the system? So intelligent design, and this would, of course, point to the God hypothesis. So I think this is important. And the other question, if intelligent design is done with common ancestry or without, if God used dead matter or living matter to create new groups, is more or less a minor issue.
Zanim przejdziemy do kolejnego pytania, jeżeli Państwo prowadzicie projekty naukowo-badawcze z biologii, chemii, kosmologii lub astronomii, albo też jesteście autorami tekstów z zakresu teorii ID lub dziedzin pokrewnych, a może jesteście tłumaczami, jeżeli odpowiedź na któreś z pytań brzmi tak, to zachęcamy do kontaktu przez stronę internetową Fundacji En Arche w celu nawiązania współpracy. Na czacie wyświetlamy bezpośredni link. Zapraszając do współpracy, przejdę do kolejnego pytania. Na ile reprezentatywny jest zapis kopalny i skąd o tym wiemy?
Yeah, basically, I have a little bit answered this question at the beginning of my talk with this issue of the collector's curve and the statistical tests, how you can test if the fossil record is still incomplete in terms of these macroevolutionary transitions, or if it is complete enough to say something about the pattern that we find in terms of these discontinuities. So these statistical tests have been very elaborated. They have been done in a lot of groups of different organisms of different eras. And as I said, we have a very high completeness in terms of, let's say, the family level. So in vertebrates, for example, more than 85% of the recent groups of vertebrate animal families have been found in the fossil record, and this extends also to extinct vertebrate families. So this would be the intermediate steps that would show how body plans could transform. Of course, we will never have a complete fossil record in terms of species. And this is because what usually happens is that an organism, when it dies, it will not fossilize. When a bird dies in your garden, it will rot and will be eaten by ants. And you need very special conditions that something gets fossilized. It has to be embedded under sea in conditions without oxygen and without smaller life forms, microbes that would deteriorate the carcass, and then it has to be covered with sediment very quickly, and then we get these fossils preserved. Or you need other ways like embedding in amber, for example, in tree resin. So fossilization is rare, but now we have found so many millions of fossils and so many localities due to the digging activity of humans, mostly not for scientific purposes, but for excavating minerals or building roads. Or there have been so many fossils discovered in the past decade that we can use these statistical tests to be sure that the signal of discontinuity is not based on an incomplete fossil record.
Okej. A jak pan myśli, skąd wzięła się rozdzielnopłciowość?
Yes, so the origin of sexuality in evolution is a strong debate in evolutionary science itself. And of course, the theory is not that you have a kind of chicken egg problem. So there would be a male first or female first, and what did it do without a mate? But that this distinction first between first you would have had a cell that is simply splitting, and there you would have not even a distinction between the body and the reproduction cells, which we have basically. Our body dies, but the reproductive lineage of cells is potentially at least immortal. But that would have been the first step, that you have this differentiation of a body that can die and these reproductive cells of sperms and egg cells that can then carry on in the next generation, and not that just the cell splits and basically becomes the next generation. And then you would have a differentiation of these reproductive cells into male and female cells in the beginning facultatively. So it would not have happened in one step. That is the theory. So the prediction from the theory is that something happened very early in the origin of the eukaryote cells and of multicellular animals that brought this distinction of male and female sex. The problem to test these hypotheses is that there we are in a realm where fossil preservation is next to impossible. So we are prior to the Avalon explosion, in a window of time where there were only single-celled organisms, and where we simply cannot find these structures in the fossil record. So there we don't know if there was a discontinuous event or not, because this cannot be preserved in fossils.
A co pan sądzi o radiowęglowej metodzie oznaczania wieku z zapisów kopalnych?
Yes. Yeah. So first, it's not done with carbon. So carbon dating is used in archaeology because it only goes back about 40,000 years, which is not really paleontology. That would be the last ice age. So what is used are similar methods of radiometric dating, but not using carbon isotopes, but others like lead and uranium, or argon or kalium, or similar isotopes that have other decay rates and therefore go back far more back in time. So these methods, of course, have been very much developed in the past decades, and problems that were present in the beginning have meanwhile been solved. And it's no longer the case that we require prior assumptions of, let's say, a constant decay rate. We do not need prior assumptions about the initial presence of daughter isotopes. This has all been solved with so-called isochrone and discordia methods in radiometric dating. And I'm very confident that these dating methods are correct. And actually, there has been a study by a creation science institution, the Institute for Creation Research in America, and they tried to disprove and discredit radiometric dating. And their employee was a physicist, a scientist called Gerald Aartsma. And he's still a young Earth creationist. He wanted to refute radiometric dating and wanted to refute carbon dating as an example, not because it is used in paleontology, but as an example of the method of radiometric dating. But to his own surprise and against his will, after 2 or 3 years of study, what he found is that all the usual counter arguments that you find, especially by creationists, against radiometric dating turned out to be not tenable, and that the dating method is actually valid. Now, that led to his removal from Institute of Creation Research. So he lost his job because he made the incorrect finding against his will. He is still a young Earth creationist for theological reasons, but he admits that radiometric dating is a valid method and that the critiques are not substantially true. And that is my position as well. So I think the radiometric dating is a very good dating technique. And what gives me confidence that it's correct is also that several layers have already been dated also with different isotopes, with different methods of radiometric dating, the same layers by different research groups, and they came to similar results concerning the age. And what you also have to understand is that every publication that gives a radiometric dating for a paleontological locality doesn't just give you a date, but it gives you a date with an error margin. So it doesn't say just it's 228 million years old, but it says it's 280 million years old plus minus 265,000 years or something like that. So there are error margins, but these are very well known and very well established and are always given together with the publication. And so these dating methods are well established, and I think there is no way around the age of the Earth in terms of millions of years. Everything else is you can justify theologically, but you cannot have science on your side.
A czy naukowcy tacy jak Dawkins i Coyne naprawdę wierzą w to, co głoszą? Czy mają oprócz tego jakieś motywacje ideologiczne, może polityczne?
Yes, I think that's two questions. So they certainly do have ideological motivation. So it's very clear with people like Dawkins and Coyne in their aggressiveness and the way they treat religious believers and opponents of Darwin's theory, that they have an axe to grind, and that the question is not just academic, scientific interest and differences, academic differences, but that they want atheism and materialism and naturalism to be true, and that they really hate the other position of theism and supernaturalism. So this is certainly true. Do they honestly believe what they say? I also think that they do. I think that they honestly believe that they are right, and that believers are crazy and retarded and believing in medieval or Iron Age myths and so on, and that creationists are science deniers and so on. They ignore a lot of evidence, of course. They do not really explore the evidence fairly and look at the arguments. That was something that very early convinced me that there's something wrong, because I discovered that the intelligent design arguments were not fairly represented and not fairly addressed by people like Dawkins or Coyne or P.C. Myers or others. So I think they have a worldview which they want to defend and fiercely want to defend. But I also think that they believe what they say. Sometimes their incorrect claims can be based on ignorance. So when Dawkins make claims that there are no out-of-place fossils, this is simply ignorance of the fossil record. So there are out-of-place fossils that are not found in the layers where they should be expected, and they contradict previous assumptions of the evolutionary timeline. This is commonplace in paleontology. So Dawkins simply is not a paleontologist and tells nonsense there. And also when he speaks about philosophy and tries to refute, let's say, the first way of Thomas Aquinas with totally silly and ridiculous strawman arguments, then he's simply speaking outside of his field of expertise. But I think he does it honestly, and he doesn't lie and tries to falsify the facts deliberately. He misrepresents the facts, but I think he's influenced by his worldview background and does it with good intentions, even as misguided as they may be.
Czy teoria ID ma praktyczne zastosowanie w paleontologii? No i jakie konkretnie?
Yes. So I already said one, and that is this waiting time problem. So exploring the mathematical feasibility of the Darwinian process. And this is an application not only which shows then that the Darwinian process of random mutation, natural selection has a problem. So in a kind of negative argument, something that is often said as an attack to intelligent design theory, or it's a God of the gaps argument or an argument from ignorance. But it's also a positive argument, because then you can ask, what processes do we know in the universe by our uniform and repeated observation that can account for sudden explosions of information? And we require information for these transformations in biology, genetic information. So what processes do we know that can account for such infusions of informations that make abrupt jumps in terms of information content? And the only cause that we know that is now in operation is the activity of an intelligent agent that is planning and creating something to achieve his goal. And so you can make a positive argument from these discontinuities that we discover in the fossil record for design. And of course, you can make other arguments for design, positive arguments from other fields like molecular biology or the origin of life and so on. So that is one application in the fossil record. Generally, what we can do with intelligent design research in biology is you have a different approach to structure. So, for example, based on the assumption of evolution and of Darwinist naturalism, people assumed that the genome is basically is rubbish and is junk, so-called junk DNA, just remains from this long million-year process, kind of dead parts of the genome, and only few parts are really coding. And what was discovered with the so-called ENCODE project and other discoveries in molecular biology is something that would have been much easier to discover with a design approach. When you have a design approach, you would say, well, this genome probably has a function even in those parts that are not coding for proteins. And that's actually what turned out to be true, that all these so-called pieces of junk DNA, 80% or more of the genome, is not junk, but has a function. So having a different attitude to structures in terms of this design metaphor and design approach can lead to other questions. And if you have other questions at nature, you will get different answers and make different discoveries. So no scientist just goes into the lab and looks without questions. If somebody would tell you, look, the first question you would ask is, look at what? Why? What should I look for? So scientists have to ask questions, and the design approach can guide your question in a way that leads to different discoveries that can maybe even lead to discoveries that have application in terms of cancer research. That is something our research project currently on this waiting time project has also application in terms of origin of cancer. There are a lot of applications of the intelligent design approach, but even if there wouldn't be application, of course, it's still one of the main goals of science to find out what is the nature of nature and what is behind everything. And therefore, it's also the search for truth, of course, and for the best explanation of the data is a goal in itself that is worth exploring.
Czy teoria ID jest zaprzeczeniem darwinizmu, czy może jego rozwinięciem?
It's neither. I think intelligent design theory, of course, it depends what you mean with Darwinism. If you mean with Darwinism simply this theory of common descent with modification, then intelligent design theory is agnostic about this. It is compatible as well with universal common ancestry with modification as it is with limited common ancestry, as it is compatible with creation, special creation, progressive creation, or even young Earth creation, which is not really popular among intelligent design theories, but there are a few exceptions. But basically, the design approach is simply looking for evidence that is best explained by the activity of an intelligent agent or by infusion of information from outside the system, rather than just chance and necessity, chance and laws of nature. And this is an empirical method that is totally uncontroversial in fields like forensics, to find out was somebody murdered or did he die from natural causes, or in archaeology is some structure, some artifact made by humans or by erosion, or in SETI research is some signal from outer space, natural origin from some kind of astronomical object, from a quasar or pulsar star, or is it a signal from an alien civilization? Everywhere these design methods are used to distinguish design from chance and necessity. And intelligent design just says, well, let's decide the evidence if we can find something like this also in biology or the realm of cosmology and physics. And intelligent design is agnostic concerning this part of Darwinism. If we talk about this claim of a purely naturalistic process, an unguided process, then of course the conclusion of design would be opposing to naturalism, because the conclusion is there was an intelligent agent responsible for at least some phenomena in the history of life, while Darwinism would claim there was not. So there is a contradiction, at least in the conclusion, not in the method. The method to look for the evidence is totally irrespective of if we find evidence for that and if the evidence is best explained by intelligent design. So looking for the stuff and let nature decide, let the evidence decide, and let's follow the evidence wherever it leads is also totally uncontroversial and agnostic towards worldview. But if we come to the conclusion of intelligent design based on the evidence, then it's of course a contradiction to the naturalistic process of neo-Darwinism. Not the question of common ancestry. It could be common ancestry or not. We don't know. But if it is common ancestry, it's common ancestry with infusion of information by an intelligent agent.
Przed nami ostatnie pytanie dzisiejszego wieczoru. Niedoskonałość zapisu kopalnego jest piętą achillesową ewolucjonizmu. Czy istnieje coś takiego jak pięta achillesowa teorii ID?
Actually, I didn't really understand the question. So the Achilles heel of... Okay. Yeah. Okay. So the question is, now we have seen there are problems for Darwinism. Are there also problems for intelligent design theory. Not that I see yet, but of course there could be problems for intelligent design theory. And that is something that I find very important. The intelligent design theory claims, and I think truthfully claims, that it's a scientific theory, and scientific theories should be falsifiable. It should be possible to test them and to potentially refute them. So intelligent design theory, in my view, has not been refuted. But here is, for an example, how you could refute it. Bill Dembski, one of the founders of intelligent design theory, has shown that there is something that is called a universal probability bound, which means you can calculate, based on the size of our universe, on the age of the universe, based on the number of elementary particles, the number of potential events, and therefore the probabilistic resources, what could happen by chance in our universe. And there are certain events that could happen by chance based on these resources of time and matter in our universe. Think, for example, if you throw dice, to get 3 sixes in a row 10 times after the other is nearly impossible if you throw the dice only 100 times. But if you throw them 100 billion times, then it might happen. So that's probabilistic resources. So Bill Dembski calculated that based on chance and necessity, you could not generate more than 500 bit of new specified information. So not just a random pattern of signs, but specified information that has a meaning, that is corresponding to an independently giving pattern. Not more than 500 bit in our universe. So the only thing you have to do to refute this basic claim of intelligent design theory is to create a computer program that simulates, in a way, evolution, and that creates complex new structures that were not secretly put into the algorithm in the programming, but that really originated by mere chance and necessity in this computer simulation. And there would be large amounts of bits and bytes of new information originating. Then you would have refuted this universal probability bound, and that complex structures could arise by natural processes, and then the claim by intelligent design would be refuted. So there could be problems for intelligent design theory, but up to now, everything that I have seen that critics came up with were either strawmen, misrepresenting the argument and then knocking down a strawman, or misrepresenting the evidence and not showing the real true evidence that is given by the most modern natural sciences. But I haven't seen any kind of convincing empirical refutation of intelligent design. So there are no problems yet, but there could be problems, and that's a good thing because it means intelligent design is a testable scientific theory.
Bardzo dziękuję panu doktorowi i państwu za udział w wydarzeniu i gorącą dyskusję. Thank you. Nie udało nam się udzielić odpowiedzi na wszystkie pytania, dlatego zapraszamy do śledzenia naszego facebookowego fanpage'a facebook.com Fundacja En Arche Informacja, gdzie będziemy publikować odpowiedzi na nie. Zapraszamy też na grupę facebook.com/groups / w poszukiwaniu projektu publiczna, gdzie prowadzone są dyskusje na temat teorii inteligentnego projektu, a więcej o działalności doktora Bechly możecie państwo dowiedzieć się ze strony w poszukiwaniu projektu, gdzie publikowane są tłumaczenia i artykuły autorskie, wywiady, a także teksty krytyczne względem teorii ID. Fundację można także znaleźć na Twitterze oraz na platformach YouTube i Instagram. Wszystkie linki zostały umieszczone na czacie. Warto także odwiedzić naszą stronę www i zapisać się do newslettera. Thank you, Mr. Doctor. Thank you, Professor.
So, thank you.
Na koniec kolejna niespodzianka. Po wydarzeniu otrzymacie Państwo maila z ankietą do wypełnienia. 10. osoba, która prześle odpowiedzi, otrzyma od Fundacji w prezencie najnowszą książkę z serii Inteligentny Projekt. Kryzys teorii ewolucji Michaela Dentona. Zapraszamy do udziału w ankiecie. A tymczasem jeszcze raz w imieniu Fundacji En Arche dziękuję za dzisiejsze spotkanie zarówno Państwu, jak i naszemu gościowi specjalnemu. Wszystkiego dobrego i zapraszamy po więcej. Dobrego wieczoru i do zobaczenia.